Laura's daughter spoke out in 2003 that she was being abused by her stepfather. She later recanted and withdrew the accusation. However, her daughter was convicted of false accusations in juvenile court. Her mom and the authorities were convinced she was being dishonest. But where there was smoke, there was fire. Walter and Laura had been married for 9 years. They entered the union both as divorces from a previous marriage. They met at Clint Black's concert at Merriweather Post Pavilion in Columbia. In the budding relationship, there was charm, attraction, and the acceptance of Laura's 2 kids. Walter could have easily said it was love at first sight, but Laura had reservations. Coming from what she deemed a bad marriage, she was very skeptical of her next move. Nevertheless, with Walter's unavoidable charm and a proposal in Pizza Hut, Laura soon became Mrs. Rogers. They were married less than 2 years after meeting. In the first 3 years of marriage, Laura had come to realize that she was far removed from that bad marriage she once had with her ex-husband. Her current marriage was wonderful. Walter treated her wonderfully. Soon, something changed in the condition of her marriage. She would later describe it as terror. The family relocated regularly. They must have lived in a half-dozen communities in a decade. With that came the emotionally abusive and controlling demeanor of Walter. She was away from family, and with the constant movement, the chances of meeting people were slim. Laura was not permitted to have friends or find employment. She used to work in a secretarial capacity while Walter was a laborer. He used his contracting work as a means of isolating the family, as they were constantly moving for him to find work opportunities. There were growing concerns about her husband's controlling behavior. Walter was quick to anger. He had threatened to kill her before, and sometimes he brandished a knife to keep her in line. One time she recalled a baseball bat being swung at her head, however. It landed on the refrigerator instead. Physical abuse was few and far between. Laura divulged that Walter chose to intimidate and demean her constantly. She admitted that the emotional abuse left deeper scars. Soon the marriage felt like a trap. She wanted to escape the emotional and sometimes physical abuse that had become her reality. Her main thoughts were about the safety of her children. She lived in fear, knowing that if she tried to leave, Walter would have stopped her, and if she managed to escape, he would find her. She feared either choice, so she stayed to protect her children. But was that the safest decision for the family? It turns out it wasn't, even for Walter Rogers. While living in Anne Arundel County, Maryland, in an apartment attached to an office building, 36-year-old Laura got some disturbing news that would rock the core of the family's lives. In the wee hours of the morning of April 23, 2004, Laura had avoided the sounds of the TV the whole night, though she couldn't sleep. Just before the sun came up, she remembers reaching under the bed where her husband slept for the shotgun. She walked back to the living room with the .20 gauge, snapping it open, slipping a shell into its chamber. She saw her 43-year-old husband, Walter Rogers, asleep on his right side. Laura doesn't remember holding the gun less than a foot away from her husband, nor aiming it at his left eye or even pulling the trigger. She recalls hearing the gunshot. She ran asking herself, "What the hell have I done?" When her children came to make inquiries, she ushered them back to bed saying she didn't know what happened. Earlier that day, Laura had bought the shotgun during a trip to the laundromat. She walked over to the nearby Walmart to purchase it just as her husband had instructed her to. She said he was concerned about thefts in their isolated neighborhood. Later that evening, her 16-year-old daughter, who was 7 months pregnant, had disclosed that the father of her unborn child wasn't a boy at school. The would-be father is her stepfather, Walter Rogers. For Laura, this probably was the case of, here we go again. But this time, her daughter was brave enough to reveal the proof that was always there. Behind the collection of Playboy magazine in Walters' armoire was the videotape that would undoubtedly convince Laura of her husband's rape and sexual abuse of her daughter. The family had planned on going on a trip to North Carolina the next day, and while Walters was securing his tools in the yard and preparing for the trip, she watched the disturbing video. Laura slipped the tape into a video camera and watched as much of it as she could bear on the camcorder's tiny screen in the bedroom. The images showed Walter Rogers engaging in a variety of sex acts with her daughter. For Laura, this was the ultimate betrayal. Her whole body went numb. "I'm not sure what happened," she recalled. "At that point, I knew that he was doing it, and there was no way for him to convince me otherwise." Walter had a history of manipulating the crowd. He was very convincing. In the past, when her daughter spoke to the Anne Arundel School about her stepfather's sexual abuse in May 2023, he convinced Laura, the social servant, and the police that he did nothing wrong, and basically, he was a saint. Walter was very convincing, she said. He became so persuasive that the girl was eventually prosecuted for filing a false police report. A tearful Walter had told the investigator in an interview that she had lied about the same thing before, in Mississippi. She was accusing him falsely. He lamented that his world is caving in. Health problems, just getting by. "I didn't do this." The incident Walter referred to in Mississippi happened sometime in 2000. The stepdaughter complained that Walter Rogers had run his hand across her chest. She later admitted that he had been abusing her since the age of 7. There were videotapes of the abuse that Walter forced her to watch and threatened to hurt her if she told anyone. After investigations, Rogers was charged with a crime. Records showed that police knew about the allegations of a possible videotape. Apparently, they did not act upon it. They didn't question the household about the possibility of any videotapes, nor did they apply for a warrant to search the premises. The case in Mississippi was eventually dismissed. However, in 2003, his stepdaughter was the one prosecuted and convicted in the Anne Arundel County Juvenile Court in Maryland. At the time, despite the abuse Laura had experienced, she could not imagine that her husband would sexually abuse her daughter. Now armed with the videotape evidence of the abuse, Laura realized she had been telling the truth all along. Walter had repeatedly raped her daughter, convincingly lied about it, had the girl prosecuted, and went right back to abusing her. After Laura turned off the tape, she did not confront him. She recalled him coming back inside the house. He told her to be sure to pack enough for a week's trip. She replied, "Okay." On the morning of April 23, 2004, Laura Rogers called the police to report that her husband, Walter, committed suicide in their Maryland home. He used a 20-gauge shotgun. The police on the scene were satisfied that it was suicide, but detectives began to ask questions. 2 days later, Laura's daughter confessed to the killing. However, her confession became invalid when detectives handed her the gun and asked her to show them how she loaded it. She was unable to. The child did not know how. When detectives told Laura about her daughter's confession, she quickly admitted to pulling the trigger herself. County police charged Laura with first-degree murder in the shooting death of her husband. Soon, Prosecutor Kiesling and Laura's attorney Allers said they agreed to a plea deal. Offering a plea deal was partly to spare Laura Rogers' daughter the emotional ordeal of having to testify about the abuse at trial. Laura pled guilty to manslaughter, facing up to 10 years in prison. Laura Rogers' attorney, Allers, called Walter Rogers a person who took a sick and sadistic pleasure in killing the spirit of other people, and said that he continued to rape the child even in pregnancy. Allers said the shooting was a homicide without a victim. He went on to say, "This man, Walter Rogers, abused people probably from adolescence to the time of his death." Outside the court, Prosecutor Kiesling gave her thoughts about the case. To me, it appeared that she was a person who had been pushed to the brink. She said Walter Rogers had abused his wife psychologically and physically, and terrorized her, for example, swinging a baseball bat so that it narrowly missed her head. "It's time for it to be over for her," said Kiesling. Kiesling declined to discuss Walter Rogers' family or their thoughts about the plea arrangement, except to say that many of them were victims of his abuse. In Anne Arundel County Circuit Court, Judge Hackner sentenced Laura to a maximum of 10 years in prison. However, in cases of battered wives killing the men they say tormented them, it's seldom the justice system engages in what transpired in court that day. 6 months after she killed her husband, Laura Rogers was released from the Anne Arundel County Detention Center. Judge Paul Hackner called the victim a horrible human being and ordered that Laura Rogers be freed from jail. He suspended all but the 198 days in which she already served. Hackner had said that a diagnosis of battered spouse syndrome warranted Laura Rogers' release. The abuse of her daughter was reviewed and discussed at length throughout the proceeding. However, the psychiatrist's diagnosis that Laura Rogers suffered from battered spouse syndrome was the most significant factor in his decision. His decision came after viewing the videotape in his chambers and hearing defense attorney Ahler's description of the victim. "You'll be released sometime this afternoon." Laura Rogers was a free woman. She could now go home to her children and move on with her life. The state did not oppose the judgment passed. This was a murder case that prosecutors never wanted to put in front of a jury. In interviews after her release, Laura admitted, "When I saw this man horribly violating my daughter, I couldn't let it continue," she said. "I couldn't change the past, but damn, I could change the future." Laura shared that taking a human being's life is something I will have to live with for the rest of my life. But she said she felt she could breathe again for the first time in years. She said that to understand her situation, the terror and fear that she and her family endured, was to understand that she had no other choice. The teenage girl's conviction was vacated shortly after. By then, the evidence in support of her claims was irrefutable. Her baby boy was born over the summer and put up for adoption. DNA tests proved that Walter Rogers was the father. There were subsequent reports of alleged sexual abuse occurring with the other children in the Rogers household, including the younger son she shared with Walter. At age 21, Walter's stepdaughter filed a suit against Anne Arundel County for negligence, professional liability, false imprisonment, false arrest, and negligent supervision.